Welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Thanks for joining me. Big shout out to all of you who leave me comments, who subscribe, who get involved in my live chats on the premieres. You make a massive difference. Thanks to all my Patreon subs and also my YouTube membership. You are amazing. You help me to make good content, and I hope content that you appreciate. If you're new here, I release crime content on a Wednesday and a Sunday religiously. I say crime and consistency is my catchphrase. The case that I'm going to cover today is one that you guys asked me to, so thank you. I thought I knew this case, and then I started my deep dive and was truly stunned by the depravity of this crime. I'm going to take you back to the year 2000. This is when Jodie Foster, and I'm not talking about the one who played Tallulah back in the day. I'm not talking about the woman who was in Silence of the Lambs. No, I'm talking about a completely separate Jodie Foster. But she was living with her 2-year-old daughter, Hannah, and they moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Chico, California. As soon as she moved in, she felt something really, really strange was going on. She felt like she was being watched, and really strange things started to happen, and she couldn't explain why these things were happening. Lights would mysteriously turn themselves on. Clocks would show the wrong times. Objects even moved on their own, and the blinds in the apartment would go up and down. And these events would often happen at exactly 3:37 a.m. in the morning. But that's not all that happened to Jodie. She also started to have these really vivid dreams. She saw a young man with glasses and another person stalking a girl. The girl had dark brown hair. In these visions, she saw this girl hung by her hands naked in the basement of a man's home. The man was enjoying the scene. He was fondling and whipping the girl before shooting her in the stomach and then slitting her throat. In this scene, she saw blood streaming down the girl's body, and the man was biting her, biting off a nipple, taking a watch and taking a lock of her hair, and then he placed these in a small wooden box. Then the man would go upstairs. There would be a woman there. She'd be rocking on a couch. Then he'd make her go downstairs to see the body. She then would see the pair wrapping the body in a blue blanket, driving to a remote dirt road and burying the body in a shallow grave. But Jodie Foster wasn't the only individual in the apartment who was seeing strange things. Jodie's 2-year-old daughter also told her mum that a woman with brown hair, worn in a flip, visited her at night. That this woman would kiss her on the forehead, and the little girl called the woman My Liz. She was really scared as a parent because she was having these vivid dreams and these strange occurrences, but now it was affecting her daughter too. So Jodie decided that they needed to move out of the apartment, so they temporarily stayed next door with a friend, but that's how scared they were. We're not talking about somebody who wasn't acting on these feelings. Whatever was going on in the intuition and instinct, it meant that Jodie needed to escape. Soon after she moves in with a friend, she starts talking to an old man in the complex, and he tells her, "You're not the first person who's felt those things. You're not the first person to experience those strange goings on." And apparently, people would move in, but they'd never stay long. He also told her about a man in nearby Red Bluff who had been arrested 16 years earlier. And the reason he'd been arrested? He'd kept a woman as a sex slave for 7 years. But the truth was, it was suspected that he had abducted and had murdered another woman before this. And that woman? Well, she lived in Jodie's apartment. She'd vanished without a trace in 1976. And if that wasn't coincidence enough and scary enough for Jodie, it transpired that the woman had been a brunette who often wore her hair in a flip. And although she wasn't My Liz, as Jodie's 2-year-old daughter had referred to regarding the woman who was visiting her at night, her name was actually 18-year-old Marie Elizabeth Spanhake. Now, she was known to her friends as My Liz. So Jodie's 2-year-old daughter, who said that My Liz came and kissed her on the forehead in the evening, and quoted that to her mother. That was actually Ma Liz, we are to assume. Not my Liz, Ma Liz. And with that in mind, let's get on with today's true crime. On the 19th of May, 1977, 21-year-old Colleen Stan, well, she's hitchhiking from her home in Eugene, Oregon. She's basically hitchhiking along Interstate 5 and her destination was California. She was going to go to a really good friend's birthday party. She was very experienced as a hitchhiker. She was one of those people who used it as transportation regularly. She was savvy. She knew the kind of people that she should hitch with and the kind of people she should avoid hitching with. So it's not as if this was an individual who was naive and green when it came to taking lifts off strangers. She'd been hitching for a while and she'd made it as far as Red Bluff, California. And she had on that day turned down 2 lifts from 2 people who stopped. So she was obviously someone who was willing to potentially offend people by saying no to their offers of lifts, but it also suggests that she was somebody who thought about the kind of people that may be at risk. Because when you're hitchhiking, you've got to understand that there may be some unsavory characters who stop and pull over. Not everyone is trying to get you from A to B. Anyway, a blue van pulls over after she's got to this place in Red Bluff, and she decides, yeah, I'm going to accept the ride. And the reason for that, it makes sense when you actually look from the outside in. It's a young family. Husband was 23-year-old Cameron Hooker, and he was with his wife, and he was with their baby. So they seem like a really safe option, because why would it not be safe to get into somebody's family van? If you're going to hitch, being around a woman and a baby, that's going to make you feel super safe. But it's also something that can affect our bias and skew our judgment, isn't it? We've seen that play out in situations like with Myra Hindley, with Rose West. Women are often seen as these safe places where nothing bad could happen as long as a woman is present. And of course, that's just not true. But in those moments where you're making snap decisions, I completely understand and concur as to why she got in to that van that day. But sadly for her, the Hookers were certainly not your average family, as she would very sadly soon discover. Now, everything initially seems to be going okay. And then they stop at a service station. Colleen gets out, she goes to the toilet, and while she's in there, she said she had one of those really deep gut feelings that just said, get away, escape. And she's so moved by this that she even thinks about climbing through the window and running. But in spite of that resounding connection with her gut, she dismisses those concerns. She thinks she's overreacting, she's being oversensitive, she's letting fear take over. So she returns to the van. So when she gets back to the van, that she notices something that she hadn't noticed before, and it's a wooden box, and that's on the seat next to her. So she takes this in, but it doesn't necessarily provoke anything in her. All she knows is it seems a little bit strange. Around 20 miles further on, Hooker suddenly turned off the interstate and onto a dirt road. And then he threatens Colleen. He puts a knife to her throat. Bear in mind, this happens in moments. And it brings into full view that feeling and fear that she had in those service station toilets where she was thinking about escaping, because suddenly she's presented with her worst fear. Her life's at risk. So she has this knife put to her throat, and then she's gagged, she's blindfolded, and she's handcuffed. And then she realizes with absolute horror what the purpose of the wooden box next to her is for. That's when she realizes that she really is in intense danger. Because what Colleen didn't know on that particular day, where she was just going off to experience the joy of a friend's birthday party, is that she had taken a lift from a sexual sadist. Hooker was literally obsessed with bondage and torture. And until this point, Janice, who was his wife, well, she had been the subject of all of his sexual fetishes. And yes, she had consented. But the truth is that she didn't share her husband's insatiable paraphilia. In fact, she was struggling with it. She didn't enjoy, in particular, his painful bondage practices because he was into specific forms of BDSM. It wasn't that he enjoyed a consenting partner. It was that he liked to see somebody in pain, and he didn't necessarily like to think that they wanted that pain. So we're not talking about the practice of bondage where there are two consenting individuals, where there is potentially a master and a submissive, and both gain from that experience. We're talking about him having a particular like for causing an individual who is not willing that kind of pain. So Janice has come to this agreement with him. The agreement is they're going to abduct a young woman, and that young woman would serve as Hooker's sex slave. Basically, Janice would then avoid, as far as she was concerned, his perverted fantasies because he would have a muse, so to speak, an unwilling muse to do that on. Apparently, he'd always fantasized about practicing bondage on a woman who couldn't say no. That was something that he fantasized about constantly. This idea of being truly dominant, knowing that there is absolutely nothing that the victim can do. They are completely within your control. One of the things that he agreed with Janice was that he would never have penetrative sex with his slave. For some bizarre reason, they had a boundary. Who knew that when abducting and imprisoning a sex slave who is completely unwilling in that experience, that the wife would have specific instruction, such as you shouldn't have actual sex with her, intercourse orientated sex, because, that would be adulterous. Whole heap weird when you think about what I've just described, but there you go. Obviously, this is where they drew a line. I can keep a sex slave and abuse and torture her, but raping, well, that's crossing a line in our relationship. Warped is not even the beginning to describe that. So Hooker had spent time. Remember, we see with these predators, it's not just the actions, it's the fantasy of the actions that really drives them. So he spent quite a lot of time constructing a kind of head box, and that head box was specifically designed to be used in the abduction of his sex slave. So he's built this. He's planned this, premeditated this, and it was horrible. Weighed about 20 pounds, and it was built in such a way that it literally shot out all natural light, all sound, even fresh air. It was just a torturous instrument. It then gets forced onto Colleen's head, gets secured in place, and then we have, of course, Colleen completely helpless, terrified, unsure of what's going to happen next, and completely in the dark. And then he just carries on driving. He's got the helpless Colleen restrained on the back seat. And in her now dark prison, she has absolutely no idea where she was or where she was going. Hooker drives Colleen, now his captive, 30 miles to his home on Oak Street in Red Bluff. That's in Tehama County. And this is where we begin 7 years of hell for Colleen. What we're going to talk about today is the 7 years this woman was taken from her family, from her friends, from her freedom. 7 years where she is a prisoner in this sadist's life at his beck and call without any rights of her own. You can imagine that the minute that Hooker gets back, he's instantly carrying out his, what I would consider, unique form of sexual torture, because he's been building up to this, hasn't he? This is a man who's been living for this moment. He's got all these ideas and fantasies in his head. He's been building a box to ensure that he can keep her captive in the car on the way home. He's literally played this out a million times in his mind, and now he's got the opportunity to do this for real. So that first night of captivity, Colleen is stripped naked, she's blindfolded, and then he suspends her by her wrists from the basement rafters. And understandably, you can imagine the kind of pain that would cause after a long period of time. So she starts crying, and then she's trying to rest her feet on something because she's got so much pain in her arms. And when she dares to do that, he just whips her. And then he says to her, if you scream, I'll sever your vocal cords. Can you imagine how terrifying that would be? He's literally saying, if you dare to retaliate, to respond, to try to draw attention to this situation that's playing out right now, that you are an unwilling participant within, I will literally sever your vocal cords. I will steal your voice. You will never speak again. Now, after around a quarter of an hour of her hanging and she's in pain, he does allow her to rest her toes on a box. And it's this time that she's trying to make things out, and even though she's blindfolded, she can just see a magazine, and it's open. And it's open on a page with an image of the woman who is in a same position as her. So he's using pornography, and it's driving him to recreate these images. But then if that isn't harrowing enough, in the fact that she's coming to her senses in this terrible situation and fearing for her life without a doubt, she then looks and sees Hooker and Janice, and they're having sex beneath her. So he's using her as a real-life pornographic prop. She's an object, isn't she? She's a sex toy, literally. She's horribly a victim in this moment, and obviously completely unwilling, but that's how he's using her. She's an object for his pleasure. So after they finish having sex, she ends up being hung for another 15 minutes, and then finally she's lowered. But as she's lowered, she's not set down so that she can walk around or move. No, she's put in a 3-foot by 6-foot wooden crate, like a coffin. And if that's not challenging enough, he even puts the head box back on. He also chains her wrists, and he ties her feet to the crate. This is her first night with this monster. The following day, Hooker takes her out of the crate, and then he places her on a homemade rack. Yeah, he has been planning this, playing this out so much. He's been designing torture equipment. So he chains her wrists and ankles to the corner of this rack, and then he just leaves her there until the following day. The pain must have been absolutely excruciating. I mean, think about the muscle cramps alone. She would have been in agony. And that's before we think about the stress and the fact that stress induces more pain, and the fact that she's in this really challenging physical position. The agony would have been extenuated by the fact that she was so terrified. Hooker is constantly looking for ways to punish Colleen, excuses that give him leverage to do further damage to her. And one day, he gives her a meal, and because she's unable to finish it, bear in mind, if you are in a situation of high anxiety and stress, often your appetite is very subdued. You don't feel like feasting when you've got some freak keeping you prisoner in a box, literally. Who is gonna feel like anything other than morsels to just survive on? But he is really offended by the fact that Colleen is not grateful for this meal, so he punishes her by hanging her and whipping her. And then he makes her finish the meal again, and then he puts her back on the rack. So it's just this perpetual cycle of agony and fear and horror. And this is her daily life. Now, for the first week or so that Colleen is a prisoner, he keeps her naked, chained to the rack, and she's got this heavy box that encases her head, from this head box that he's made. Then after this, for the next 5 months, she's kept naked, bound, and she's wearing this head box in a coffin-like box in the basement. So she is completely encased. Imagine living that way, surviving that way. Genuinely, I think about being in a situation like that, and I think I'd just wither away and die from fear. But this is her day in, day out experience. And she only gets out once a day. She gets released from that horrific compartment once a day. She gets to eat, drink, urinate, and defecate in that moment. That's the only time that she's allowed to do that, which again is terrifying. Think about your bodily functions. I don't know about you guys, but genuinely, letting me out once a day to defecate and urinate would not end well, literally. I mean, I need a wee every hour, genuinely. even when I'm not drinking a lot. My kidneys are like, just release fluid. She doesn't need that. You know, everybody has a different cycle, but the idea of having to coordinate your bodily fluids and your release of bodily functions with his timetable, again, that's torturous. She was, as you will all be imagining, subjected to regular sadistic torture. Hooker had this particular penchant for bondage. He enjoyed suspending her from the rafters. One of the things that he liked to do is to constrict her breathing, because you're in full control, aren't you? If you can stop people taking their full breath, can you be any more godlike in that moment? Certainly when we think about serial killers and they're strangling and reviving, it's that feeling of being able to control the mortality of the human being that they are attacking. So he enjoys that. He whips her. He takes things in where he can shock her with electrical cords. He burns her pubic hair with a heat lamp, so he's constantly trying to humiliate her further and harm her further. He immerses her into a bath, makes sure that it gets to a point where she's literally unable to breathe. And during the first 6 months of her being his prisoner, she's hung and whipped around 100 times. He also prevents her from having food and water regularly, so he starves her and keeps her dehydrated. Again, just another way of showing that he is the person in charge. He apparently had this fantasy. Hooker wanted Colleen to be like the female character in the book, The Story of O. So The Story of O is basically a book about a woman who is trained to be a willing female submissive to this secret society, and she gets horribly sexually tortured by its members, but obviously the whole premise is that she's becoming this willing participant, and he thinks he can recreate this. So he wants to take this work of fiction and make it real. So he wants her to, in the end, allow him to do this and to remain because she feels compelled to remain. So as opposed to becoming a prisoner, she grows into a willing submissive. And even though he isn't penetrating Colleen himself physically, he is using other objects to do that to her with. So he anally and vaginally violates her with various implements, which is, again, horrifying, because the damage that you can do to a woman using those kind of things when she is non-consensual is terrifying and can have long-term implications on her reproductive availability, on her opportunities to have safe sexual relationships in the future without pain. All of these things occur when somebody is violating you that way. The damage can be irreparable. And remember, she's not being given any kind of help from medics. So whatever damage he is doing, she's just having to live with, full stop. While she's not being sexually tortured and beaten, which we can all agree is the most harrowing thing that one can imagine as a female, Colleen is literally kept in a wooden box for up to 23 hours a day. Imagine the sensory deprivation there. I mean, even if you've stayed in a hotel room without a window, it can get a bit suffocating, can't it? It's like the human state is not to be enclosed. We are social creatures, we are animals, so being outside with nature is a part of our makeup. That's why in small apartments they tend to have quite big windows. It's to give you a sense of space. Otherwise you feel really constricted. Put yourself in a position where you are literally in a wooden box, locked in the dark, for 23 hours a day. I mean, you think about solitary confinement in prison, you think about death row in prison, that is nothing on what I've just described Colleen going through. To add to this torture, it's almost impossible to imagine adding to this torture, but we can, because Hooker is relatively clever. He knows that he wants her to remain his prisoner. He doesn't want to leave any potential for escape. So he starts to build this picture in Colleen's mind. It's so manipulative, it's so coercive, but there is some intelligence to it because remember, everything for her has shifted and changed out of the ordinary. She was just hitching a lift, and now she's spent months being locked up 23 hours a day with a man who could kill her at any moment in time, being horribly sexually molested. However, he may believe that at times they're going to have to change where they live, they're going to have to move on, and he needs to make sure that she is always going to be his prisoner. And to do that, you have to make somebody a prisoner in their mind. as well as in their body. Because for many people, the natural state of survival is to try to take a risk at points to save yourself, i.e., in this situation, to escape. So he builds this fantasy. Bear in mind that for her, the worst has happened. So the idea that there is another subtext to her abduction, that won't be too far of a stretch for her. So he introduces the company. This is an organisation that he convinces Colleen is literally everywhere. They're watching everything. And all they do is buy and sell sex slaves. And essentially, if Colleen dared to try to escape, well, a very simple result. The company would find her, they would torture her, but more than that, they would harm her family. So he's now created that additional layer. If you dare to leave, if you even try so much as to escape, it won't just be you who loses your freedom, who loses your life. It will be your family. They'll be punished for your actions too. And bear in mind what she's going through. She's going to protect her family at all costs. She won't want them to experience the daily torture that she's going through. So she starts to believe this. She becomes absolutely convinced that this organisation must exist. I mean, this is her life now. She never believed that this was possible. It seems very constructed. He seems very organised. Why wouldn't it be that there are other people who are benefiting from her imprisonment? Why couldn't it be that if she dared to try to escape, her family would pay the price? She lives in this state of perpetual fear. Firstly, of the captor that's there constantly wielding life and death over her, but also the threat posed by the company. And Hooker doesn't just tell her a story. He knows that he needs to create more than that to convince Colleen that the company was real. So on one occasion, Janice comes home. She's been to hospital. She's wearing a brace. She's basically had some knee surgery. So he uses this. And he says to Colleen, you know what? Janice used to be a slave. And the reason that her legs are like that is because the company damaged her. She tried to escape, and the results were she was harmed. Now, Janice is clearly terrified of her husband. Don't get me wrong, I have some issues with Janice. I'm not going to lie, I really do have some issues with Janice because she at any point could be going to the police and having this conversation. But we also know that coercive control is very powerful. We also know that some people are so afraid for their lives that they will just stay trapped in situations knowing that terrible things are going on because they genuinely believe that the repercussions for them will be so tragic that it's not worth them even trying to ask for help. And as we've seen, where Colleen is concerned, Hooker has managed to convince her about the company. He's managed to keep her hostage, and she herself is believing what's being said. Why are we not to believe that Janice similarly is a prisoner in this kind of circumstance? But because she's so scared of him, she corroborates that story. So she says, yeah, I was the victim of the company and my knees were affected this way because of the repercussions of me trying to escape, thus cementing that in Colleen's mind. We get to 1977, and at this point, Hooker has constructed a triangular shaped box. He wants it to fit under the stairs. He called it the workshop. Genuinely, this man is one of the sickest predators I've ever covered. Even the fact that he calls it the workshop, the fact that he takes great pleasure in creating these new monstrosities just demonstrates the depravity of certain human beings, if you can call them that. And this workshop, well, it's basically going to be Colleen's new home. Here, she gets chained up and locked inside the box all day, every day. And then she spends the nights being sexually tortured. And I can imagine the irony in this is very few of us could imagine being locked up all day, every day, and finding that preferable to what happens at night. But without a doubt, Colleen would wish to stay in that box 24/7, because the minute that she is set free from it, she's just in the chains of her predator. And then he uses her. He uses her for the gratification that serves only him. We get to January 1978. And at this point, he ups the ante a little bit psychologically with Colleen, and he gets her to sign a sex slave contract. Now, this is actually extracted from an S&M publication. Understandably, she doesn't want to sign anything that suggests that she's a willing participant in this horrific abuse. She's a victim. So she hesitates. Immediately, he says, a representative of the company was waiting for her to sign it. So now she thinks, oh my God, if I don't sign this, if I don't hand this over to him, if I don't agree, something terrible is going to happen to me, something terrible is going to happen to my family. So she signs it. Now, this effectively stated that she had to do anything that Hooker wanted. Now, this could be anything from sex to household chores, even looking after his own children. And according to the contract, he owned her soul. How arrogant and superior is this complete loser? He is so pathetic. He is so without any level of human understanding and compassion that he thinks that by getting her to sign a piece of paper, that now she feels that he is in possession of her soul, but also that somehow he is entitled to it. I mean, to get to a point in your life where you believe that you require somebody to sign away their rights to who they are so that you can have dominion over you, it says two things. It says, yes, you are a psychopathic lunatic, but it also says that you are pathetic. You are a pathetic excuse for a human being, because what you are doing there is you are making her agree under duress that she can give you what you want, meaning that she has never agreed anyway. So it's redundant. It's all about power play. It's about him seeing her sign that, feeling that she has given away the very rights to her humanity. But it's all BS. She hasn't done that at all. She's been forced into a position. After she signs this, because he now psychologically feels that he's got her absolutely in chains, he allows her upstairs. There are lots of rules that are then put in place. She's told that she has to follow these rules if she's to remain upstairs. And bear in mind what she's been through for a long period of time now. She has been his prisoner for a huge amount of time. She spent 23 hours a day locked up at times. She spent whole nights being sexually abused. Her life has been in the darkness, and now she's being allowed upstairs. She signed this contract, but it's also given her opportunity, which is to have a little bit more freedom. So now, even though we all know that this is a psychological power play, for her, it's made some benefit to her situation. Now, there are rules including that she has to refer to Hooker as master and Janice as mom. She simply gets referred to as Kay. And also, one of the things that she has to do is kneel and bow her head when she's in their presence. Don't get me wrong, the rules that are imposed on her are huge. She's not allowed to speak or even do anything without permission. She also had to wear a dog collar, and over time these wore out. And so instead, they actually get her right labia and they pierce it with an earring, like you see with pigs when they have their noses pierced, like the septum's pierced. It's a way of creating an ownership level, isn't it? You know that there is somebody who is in possession of that animal, and they're doing that with Colleen. Like the fact that they pierce the sexual area of her body with an earring, it says she belongs to us. That's the reasoning behind it. We get to February 1978. This is where I would say he crosses a line for Janice. So Hooker goes ahead, and remember the promise that he makes, he's never going to have sexual intercourse with Colleen. He goes ahead and does it. In fact, he does it in front of Janice. He claims, of course, because of course, it's never going to be his fault. He's not the issue. Bear in mind, his relationship with Janice is meant to be sacred to some degree, to the point where they've placed these boundaries. He's never allowed to actually rape Colleen. But he does this in front of Janice because he says he thinks it would excite his wife. But he knows already. Bear in mind, they've had that conversation clearly, even though it's warped as can be. Janice has made it clear, and it's evident that she doesn't want him to have sex with Colleen, and he does it in front of her, thus negating any of her feelings. Again, complete lack of empathy. So he then restrains himself from raping Colleen for a period of time. And you see, there you go. We've seen the incremental shifts and changes in the relationship with Colleen. He's gone from not being allowed to be sexually intimate with her in that way to orally raping her, to then getting to a point where he has sex with her in front of his own wife, saying it's going to titillate his wife, being told no it didn't, it was upsetting, to then stopping for a while, but then starting again. So this is a man who doesn't care about anybody else's feelings except for his own. It gets to April 1978. This is almost a year after her abduction. I mean, can you imagine how long this has felt for this poor woman? How long these days have felt of darkness and torture. Hooker and his family at this point, they move. They move to a mobile home in Red Bluff. Of course, they take their sex slave with them. And I guess to some degree, Colleen would be relieved because remember, at any moment in time, she could be removed from the equation. He could grow tired of her. They could move and not want to draw attention to her. So her life must be at risk all the time. I have to say that when they move to this mobile home, what Colleen is made to endure here just sounds like something out of a horror film. And I mean, one of those horror films that you watch and it kind of takes your breath away because you cannot imagine what somebody would have to endure to even survive this. So Hooker constructs this coffin-sized wooden box, and the box is installed under Hooker's waterbed. So the waterbed's been built on a pedestal, and that means that this coffin hole is accessible if she crawls into it underneath it. So that's her new home. Again, Colleen's made to stay in this dark, claustrophobic, confined space for up to 23 hours a day. So she's back in this constant torturous scenario of being deprived from any sensory experience. And all she's allowed in that box is a bedpan, some toilet paper, and a radio. And each time she crawled in and out of the box, she could see a purse with the photo of a woman propped up against it under the bed. She noted that this was a young, attractive brunette. You know who this woman would turn out to be? Marie Elizabeth Spanhag. Yeah. Marie, the girl who'd gone missing all those years ago. In spite of the bizarre setup between Janice and Hooker, in September 1978, she actually gives birth to her second child. That's on the waterbed, whilst Colleen lies beneath in her wooden coffin. Can you imagine giving birth to your newborn baby, to life, to new hope, all the while knowing that the man who has impregnated you is a sexual, sadistic predator, and that you have the very woman that he's abducted and raped and abused for all of this time beneath you as you push out this new life? It is so skewed to imagine somebody managing the reality of what they're enduring in that labour with the joy and euphoria of this new life, with the darkness and deceptiveness and wholly disgusting reality of what lies beneath. This is what is playing out in that moment. Now, Colleen is not stupid. She knows that if she has to survive this horrific life that she's living, then she has to try her best to be a really good slave. This means that firstly, she'll avoid the very painful torture because obviously she's building some kind of relationship with Hooker, which means that he sees her as behaving more, meaning that she avoids some of the horrific torture that she's had in the past. And also, as he starts to see her working hard to be a good slave, as agreed in her contract, he gradually gives her more freedoms. For example, when Janice worked nights, she would cook Hooker's meals. She would do the housework. Later down the line, she's even permitted to look after the Hooker's children on her own. This is when Janice got a day job and when Hooker was at work. She even did some work for Janice's employers at the house. Now, the Hookers took her wage because they didn't want her to have any freedom as far as being able to escape, but we can see the incremental loosening of the reins because they know that she's fully within their control. Now, over time, they even let her go jogging. They let her work outside in the yard. And she even helps Hooker with a building project. And you know what that building project was? Well, basically he had plans. He decided that it wasn't enough to just have Colleen. No, he wanted an underground dungeon because he wanted to get more sex slaves. That dungeon took 2 years to complete. Now bear in mind, she's helping him do this whilst at the same time, every single night, being chained to the toilet in the back bathroom. So whilst she's being given some incremental freedoms because he is absolutely convinced of the manipulation that he has over her by this point, she's still actively being reminded that she is a prisoner every single night. Now, as I've mentioned, Hooker does not keep his promise as regards refraining from raping Colleen, and between March 1980 and 1981, Hooker regularly rapes her, and this is like once or twice a week. So she is just living in this punishing purgatory. And he also commits lots of other sexual assaults on her. On one occasion, he even makes her force a whip into her vagina. And obviously she's going to comply in these things because she knows that if she doesn't, she's going to get treated more harshly. And at one point she even decides that it's a plan to let her captor know that she loves him, because she wants to let him know that there is a relationship there. She's hoping that the more that he believes that he has ultimately convinced her to remain and to not try to escape and to feel positively about him, that this will prevent the punishments growing. And, you know, she says that she's really grateful for the freedoms that he gave her because he's in a situation where he's incrementally allowing her to actually have more and more freedom, and she wants him to know and positively reinforce that she's grateful for that. Bear in mind, Colleen was terrified. She believed that Hooker was absolutely capable of killing her. She believed without a doubt that the company could come and get her at any point. And this is demonstrated, I think, more than anything, this fear, the reality of just how he had controlled her, by the fact that she did have a multitude of opportunities to get away. So I'll go through some of those with you now. The door to the mobile home was usually left open, so she could have walked out. There were neighbours literally all around. In fact, the neighbours would frequently see her and they just thought that she was a family's helper. You know, the nanny, somebody who was cleaning. They at no point had their conscience alerted to the fact that she was this prisoner. There was even a telephone on which she could have contacted the police. But this is how big the fear of the company was. It was real. It was all-consuming. They were watching her everywhere, remember? So she made absolutely no attempt to escape. And that, for a lot of people, can be incredibly difficult to get your head around, because you just think to yourself, come on, you've been brought up in a Western environment, you've seen the news, you've heard of cases of kidnapping, you recognize that there are predators out there doing horrible things. At the end of the day, come on, just walk away from this. But that's not how psychological chains work. You can convince people of so many things. You just have to think about the way that certain people have felt in the last few years. If they're told a certain amount of information from a certain place, their actions will change because they believe there are certain consequences. It's the way that we operate. So that's what he's done really effectively. During 1980, Hooker even allows Colleen to speak to her family on the telephone. This is just on a few occasions. But can you imagine that? Her family have been in a situation where they haven't known what has happened to Colleen. And he's clever on this level as well, because look, if you want to get a case to disappear, such as a missing persons case, if you don't want it to look like a crime has been committed, then damn straight, you let the victim have contact with the family. Because that will, to some degree, alleviate the fears of the family. Secondly, it will mean that they're no longer a missing person, so you can forget the police investigation. And it will give them just enough contact to allow distance, because they'll be afraid that if they try to coerce and force you or do anything to get you home or alert the authorities, that they might never hear from you again, right? Now, all those calls that are made, they were always under his strict supervision, because as far as he is concerned, he is the person who will make every decision in her life. And he knows exactly why he is doing what he is doing. The confidence that Hooker had with regards to his control over Colleen is unbelievable, isn't it? But if there is one particular event that is just beyond shocking as regards the arrogance that he has in the manipulation that he has exerted over this poor, defenseless, innocent woman, it's what happens in 1981. So after 4 years of Colleen being absent from her family, he allows her to visit them alone. Yeah, just think about that for a moment. He allows his sex slave, a woman that he has abused for 4 years, imprisoned for 4 years, violated for 4 years, to go home to a family without him. Now, beforehand, he says to her that she's allowed to go, but he consulted with the company and put up a $30,000 security deposit to cover the cost of the company watching Colleen and her family. So he's letting her go, but every single second of every single day, they are going to be scrutinised and watched by the company to make sure that she doesn't step outside the boundaries that he has created for her. Now, prior to visiting them, he actually tests her loyalty, and this is how he tests her loyalty. He made her put a gun in her mouth and made her pull the trigger. And she did. Now, that gun was empty, but that just shows the level of compliance. She didn't think that there were any other choices. She did what she was told. When she goes and visits her family, can you imagine where she would be in her headspace? She's in her family home with people who love her, who want her to be safe, surrounded by the familiarity, the normality, the food that she could eat, the drinks that she could drink, the conversations that she could have. This is all what belongs to her and used to belong to her, and yet she has this glass in front of her that no one else can see, that is preventing her from saying what she needs to say, from moving how she needs to move, from receiving the help she so sorely deserves to help, because she believes that her family are at risk. She doesn't disclose any of the ordeal that she's living through to any of her family members because she is completely terrified about what the company would do if she did. After the visit, she obediently returns to her captor. To make matters worse, and again, the power play here is utterly ludicrous, because he, after she's returned, decides that they're going to go together to see her family. And that's what they do. They visit, and he poses as her boyfriend, and there's actually a picture of them taken, and they are smiling like the happy couple. Now, even though the family now know that she is to some degree safe because they have seen her and they've spent some time with her, and now they've met this apparent boyfriend of hers, the reality is that they smell that something is seriously off. But they don't know what it is that's wrong. They kind of presume at that point that maybe she's joined some kind of cult. She had no money. Her clothes were clearly all handmade, so she wasn't in a situation of normality. Also, if she was in a cult, it would explain why they hadn't heard from her for so long. But they didn't want to push her. You know, they'd not seen her for 4 years. Why would they dare to push her any further on this situation? They were just relieved that they had seen their beloved family member again. At this point, bear in mind, the family have got a picture of Hooker with Colleen. So even though he was so superior and so sure of himself and so confident, it feels like this particular decision led to some concern. He felt like he'd gone too far with the freedoms that he'd granted Colleen. On a retrospective and reflective scenario, he'd looked back and thought to himself, hang on, A, B, or C might have happened. It might have gone horribly wrong. So therefore, I need to think about just how confident I'm getting with Colleen and maybe need to think about pulling it back. So because of his psychological fear that something could have gone wrong, he then immediately revokes her freedoms, which is incredible when you think about the fact that he has let her go home. She has been completely loyal to him. She's had ample opportunities to break his trust and to assert her freedom, and she hasn't done. She's returned obediently, and yet he's now going to take away her freedom per se. So he rapes her, then he puts her back in the box, and she'd spend the next 3 years of her life locked in that box. Don't get me wrong, there were odd occasions that she was allowed to stay out all night, but usually she just stayed in the box under his bed for 23 hours a day. She would use the toilet by manoeuvring a bedpan beneath her feet, and when she was actually in the box, she wasn't allowed to move. She wasn't allowed to make any noise. And for the hour that she was allowed out of the box, she would be fed scraps of food and then she would be tortured. That was her life. If you think about where she was in this box, under a waterbed, in a trailer with absolutely no air conditioning, she would be forced to endure during the summer months 100 degrees Fahrenheit. How harrowing would that be? 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, Hooker's children were actually told at this point that Colleen had left, because bear in mind, she had been looking after the kids. They were completely unaware that she is literally under the bed, that she is in the house with them. They just managed to convince the kids that she's left, full stop. Now, at the end of 1983, Hooker then moves Colleen from this horrific situation under the waterbed into the underground dungeon. Now, that's been dug with her help, remember? And I say a dungeon, if I'm honest, it's little better than a large hole in the ground. But he's worried. Hooker gets worried pretty quickly because he feels that one of the children might have seen her. And so he believes that it's not a safe place to put her in. So he moves her back under the bed. Now she's back in her box. I mean, this has been going on for years and years. It's unbelievable to imagine the stamina and staying power that Colleen has to just be able to survive this. We get to January 1984 and Hooker relents a little bit. You know, she's been very obedient. She's been somebody who's returned home and been loyal. There've been plenty of opportunities for her to escape and she hasn't. And that little bit of confidence starts to return. He decides that he's going to give Colleen some more freedom. So he starts off by letting her out of the box at night. He chains her to a toilet, don't get me wrong, in the bathroom. But the point is that she has more freedom in respect that she can move around a little bit. Then, May 1984, well, he ups the ante on her freedom. And he actually lets her go and work at a local hotel as a maid. Now, he takes all of her paychecks, of course. He's financially exploiting her now. You know, he may as well earn money from his slave as well as use her to sexually satisfy his sadistic pleasures. He would give her $20 of spending money. So suddenly she had a tiny amount of money for herself. And it's at this point that he decides that he's going to reintroduce her to his children. And again, he allows the neighbours to see her. So he's building up this picture of possibility again, where she is just part of their life. She is a willing participant in their world. The kids get to see her and know her, and she's very useful. She's bringing in money and she'll be able to do babysitting. And she is so compliant by this point. He is so convinced of her compliance that he isn't afraid of the consequences. But there's a breaking point that's going to come. And the breaking point is around Janice. Now, bear in mind, a lot of us will feel, shall we say, conflicted about Janice and her actions so far, but we always have to bring in the sense that this was a young woman who was very much controlled by a man who showed great potential for harm. We've seen that in the way that he's treated Colleen. But she's had some very clear boundaries, hasn't she? She didn't want him to have sexual intercourse. As far as she was concerned with Colleen, we would call it violation and rape. But nonetheless, she said that she didn't want him to do that, and he's breached those boundaries. But now he says that he wants to make Colleen his slave wife. So he's upping where Colleen lies in their world together. Yeah, she's a slave, but she's a wife. Now bear in mind, that would be very painful for Janice. Even though she's living in what can only be described as a hellhole situation, she has retained her loyalty and remained loyal towards him. Now he's at this point basically having threesomes with them. Janice was really unhappy about that as well. But he uses God this time and says, look, you have to obey, you have to be submissive according to the Bible, otherwise you will go to hell. I'm just going to throw it in there now, Hooker. I'm not sure in the Bible there is a specific parable, verse, chapter that suggests that keeping somebody in a box under a bed 23 hours a day and using her as a sex slave whilst you also profess to be married, when in the Ten Commandments it clearly states that you shall not commit adultery, is something that God is going to be like, oh yeah, you should totally use the Bible as a way to bash your wife into believing that she'll go to hell if you don't allow yourself threesomes or to promote your slave to slave wife. So automatically, aside from the fact that he's a whole heap of a manipulative piece of crap, the truth is we can see, can't we? He's exerting the same level of control over Janice. He's somehow using the Bible, the very thing that he should not even go near. In fact, I imagine that if Hooker were to go within about 3 feet of a Bible, he'd just set on fire. He'd just self-combust. That would be the reaction. That would be God using his power or her power or its power, insert appropriately as you require, to, shall we say, create some kind of retaliation for this individual's behaviour. In my head, it's a nice scene where he does go near the Bible and then he just goes... Anyway, what was that? Apologies for my puppy who's just decided that she agrees fully with me. I know. He deserves to set on fire and probably will be doing that for a long time. Eternity in hell for him. So another thing that Janice is really struggling with at this point is that he wants to have more sex slaves. Bear in mind, we know that, don't we? He's built this dungeon. He wants to ensure that he has more and more opportunity because he's really grown in confidence. As far as he's concerned, he's got away with this for years. He's got a sex slave in Colleen who can go and visit her family and then return to him. He feels in complete control. And now he has these different feelings for Colleen. Bear in mind, he wants to assert her to slave wife. So arguably, that's telling us something about his psychology and the relationship he has with her. So even though he sees her as still submissive, there are more positive feelings towards her. That's why he wants to use the word wife. So now he wants slaves because he wants to carry out the more heinous torture that we saw him carry out and exert over Colleen at the very beginning. That's what I imagine is his reasoning behind this. I mean, it is bizarre that this is the same guy who's saying to his wife, if you don't let me have a slave wife, you're not obeying me and therefore you'll go to hell. And then in the same breath, he's like, I've just built a dungeon in the back for other sex slaves. I'm sure Jesus would be fully approving of that. Now, Colleen, bizarrely, was sometimes allowed to go to church with Janice. Again, on one level, that might seem really strange because you're thinking, well, why would you want her to be around people that could essentially help her? But on another level, it's a really clever way of further manipulation because no one is looking at you if you are bringing your sex slave to church. They're just imagining that they are a friend or they are a colleague or they are somebody of an acquaintance. But at church, this starts to really get to Janice, and she starts deciding that she needs to disclose this. So she tells the pastor how they were living. Pastor straight away is like, you need to let Colleen return home, and you need to go to the police. You need to tell on Hooker now. It gets to August 1984. Bear in mind, I'm like, I know that you're meant to be able to tell pastors and priests things that you would never tell anyone else. I get that the whole thing with the Catholic Church is just go in, confess your sins, say some Hail Marys, walk out, it'll be fine. avoid damnation fully. But I draw the line at, oh, you know, my husband has abducted a sex slave. He keeps her chained to the toilet, or she's just shoved under the bed for 23 hours a day. We've had her against her will for 7 years. At that point, I'm like, I understand confidentiality, but I am going to break it, because on a safeguarding level, this is not acceptable in any dimension or universe. Anyway, Janice is really struggling by this point. Thank God, Janice, I'm glad you are. Clearly you did have a conscience. Gets to 1984, she's having a nervous breakdown basically. And so she goes and sees the same pastor and she says, look, I need to get Colleen away from Hooker. So at this point, Janice makes a decision and she visits Colleen at work and she just tells her the truth about the company, that the company isn't real, that it's all been made up in Hooker's head. I know what a lot of you are thinking at this moment in time as well. She told the pastor twice? She told the pastor twice. Like, surely by this point, the pastor should be driving her to the police station going, look, I know we talk about confidentiality, Janice, but this is one we're going to have some kind of discourse and diversity on decision making on. You know, that is just something that kind of blows my mind a little bit. Although arguably some of you may be thinking, well, that is what is sacrosanct about the confidentiality of confession. I just think, you know, when you know something like that, you just have to break confidentiality no matter what the consequences. Understandably, Colleen is like freaking out. She's totally devastated. She's been held captive all these years on the basis that this man has access to the company who are literally watching her every move and can at any point strike her and her family. The power in that moment of suddenly recognizing, I don't need to be a prisoner. This person has lied to me all this time. Even though she would still be terrified, she would have that knowledge. I'm dealing with a man, not a corporation, not a company, just him. So on the 10th of August 1984, Colleen leaves with Janice and her children. This is whilst Hooker's at work. And Janice and the kids went to her parents' house, and then Colleen calls her own parents. At this moment in time, they wire money straight away for a bus fare. They knew something was terribly wrong. They didn't understand just how terrifying it was, the reality of what their child had been experiencing. But they instantly reach in to help. And then she telephones Hooker from the bus. And she tells him she's leaving him. And you know what he does in that moment when he hears that she's leaving? That she's finally realised that he is just this pathetic excuse for a human, that he no longer has the power over her. He bursts into tears. Bear in mind, this is a man who believes he is fully in control of this woman, and nothing that he can do to her, no level of depravity, no restriction on her freedoms can ever make her question that captivity. And here he is realising in that moment, she doesn't love him, she doesn't like him. She doesn't want to be promoted to slave or wife. She despises him. And she was only ever his victim because she didn't know how else to protect her family. So she then gets on that bus and she returns to her parents. Now, this is something that a lot of people struggle with, because when she first gets home, she does not report the ordeal to the police. And you may be staggered by this, because the reason behind why she doesn't want to tell the police is because she actually wants to give him an opportunity to reform, because Janice has asked if she will let him have this opportunity. So bear in mind, Janice leaves, Colleen returns to her family, but then Janice goes back to him. And she's encouraging him to have counselling. She's encouraging to destroy his bondage equipment. And they've got this strange triad. Even though Colleen obviously resents every moment that she's spent with him, she's confused. Even though she despises him on one level, there are these feelings that she's grown to have, because remember, he taught her incrementally to feel grateful for the freedoms that she experienced, she's confused. So in spite of the fact that you or I may imagine that we'd be running to the police and screaming for help, or maybe our family members would be arming themselves and going down to the trailer park where he lived, just throwing out some potential examples of actions after this kind of situation. The truth is that Colleen doesn't do any of that. She stays in regular contact with Hooker by both phone and letter. Understandably, this is driving Colleen's family mad. They are desperate for her to inform the authorities, but she's really resistant. As far as she's concerned, it's been 7 years of her life that she's been incarcerated by this monster, and she just wants to move past it. She just wants to put it behind her, forget all about it. And the best example that we can give psychologically here to kind of understand what Colleen's going through is a syndrome known as Stockholm Syndrome. So this term was basically coined by the media in 1973, and the reason for that, there was a bank robbery in Sweden. And various people in this bank robbery were held captive by the robbers. And as they're held captive over the period of time of being so, they develop a sympathy for the cause that these robbers have. And emotional bonds formed between the captives and the captors, to the extent that, with respect, they refused to testify against them in court. In fact, they even began raising money for their defense. So because those robbers who held them hostage didn't actually do anything horrific to them, apart from keep them captive, which is psychologically torturous, of course, what I'm saying is the expectation of the victims was it was going to be far worse. And when they started to see the captors as humans and have conversations with them about what was going on, they started to create a bias. And part of that bias is for your own survival. If you can get people on side, if you can start making people who are in charge of your safety feel that you are worthy and that you are deserving of that safety and that they start to like you, well, it's more unlikely that they'll harm you. Equally, when those captors started to have conversations with those who were in charge of killing or protecting them in that moment, because obviously that's what happens in those situations. You know, if you're somebody who's been captured, something terrible can occur to you. If you can start seeing your captor as a human being as well, psychologically, that makes it easier, because suddenly you don't have to be afraid of the predator. You can start seeing through that and see the reality of the human being behind it. It's a very rare scenario to play out, to the point where, you know, these individuals were involved in relationships to degrees with the captors, but they then went on to refuse to give evidence in court and also to actually raise money from them. It just demonstrates the psychology that people experience in these very unusual situations. So the belief is that Colleen is dealing with that. That yes, she knows what happened was heinous and wrong on one level, but she's still alive on another. And yes, she's seen the very worst of Hooker on one level, but he gave her certain amounts of freedom on another. And she's bought into this bias of just surviving. And even though he's a reprehensible excuse for a human being, she's still alive. And now she's free. This is so confusing for her. Now, ultimately, Janice, fortunately, even though she's returned to Hooker, in spite of all of this stuff that's happened, she decides in the end that the relationship is entirely toxic. So she leaves him again. She confides in a friend, and the friend who she confides in about why she's left him and what's happened and how it's played out, and they've arrived at this position, they say, look, you need to tell somebody about this. This man may well go on to harm your children. And that's the key for Janice. She suddenly realizes this man has got absolute potential to harm not just this poor woman who he kept as a sex slave, but also myself as a wife, because you've seen how he tortured her on an emotional level as well. But now her friend is bringing into sharp focus, how can you trust this man around your children? This is a man who's sadistic. What next for your family if you don't act? We all need a friend like that, don't we? We all need a friend who's like, Janice, you and I need to sit down and have a chat. Firstly, we need to have a chat about what you think obedience is in the Bible, because you're a whole heap of warped on that one. And then we need to have a chat about the fact that you're married to a monster. That kind of a friend is a helpful friend at all times. So Janice then goes back and speaks to the pastor again. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh at all because this is a terrible, tragic case, but there is that bit of me that's like, who is this pastor? What kind of secrets is he carrying if he hasn't gone and seen the police about this situation? I know, confidentiality, blah, 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 blah. I am not sure that the big God or Jesus or insert whatever deity you like would be cool with the idea of this kind of predator being on the loose. I'm not sure that's appropriate. I just think this pastor would have been like, okay, Janice, we're getting in the car right now and we're going to see the police. Anyway, she talks to the pastor this time and he decides, yeah, this isn't okay. We probably need to do something. So he then finally reports her husband to the police on the 7th of November, 1984. I'm not blaming him, by the way. I'm just saying, I'm very relieved that in the end, ultimately, when she goes a third time lucky, they're like, yeah, it's too much now. I'm gonna have to go and speak to the police. And again, that was probably very conflicting because of the fact that you take particular vows regarding how you will act when people confess to you. So I appreciate it was not simple. I am just relieved that common sense took over. So at this point, Janice does agree to tell the authorities the whole story, but she's clever. She says, I will tell you everything as long as I am granted immunity from prosecution. So basically she's saying, you know, I will confess to every sordid detail. I won't hide from the truth, but you have to give me your assurance that I will not be prosecuted. Don't know how people feel about that. Some of you may feel that she absolutely deserved to be prosecuted. Some of you may believe that she is just a victim of circumstance and punishing her would only add to the abuse that she'd suffered in her life. And some of you might be on the fence. What we can all agree is the victim here, without doubt, is Colleen, but Janice mustn't have had a nice life with this man. Janice said that she was a victim in her relationship with Cameron Hooker. She said he'd brainwashed her, he tortured her, that he used to refer to her as the whore. She claimed that she'd endured the relationship and managed it through two things: compartmentalization and denial. So this is a form of psychological defense where you have thoughts and feelings, but that you keep them separate and isolated through something called disassociation. So it's a way of knowing, but not knowing all in the same moment. So the information is present and you understand it's there, but you don't connect the feeling because it's too overwhelming. So she's kind of put Colleen and her husband's actions in boxes and just got on with her day-to-day life, knowing it's there, but not connecting it. And that's how she coped. She explained that she'd met Hooker when she was just 16 years of age. She'd been really young, she'd been really naive, and that he seemed really nice. You know, they fell in love quickly. They married 2 years later. And it's around this point that she starts to realize that it isn't all peaches and cream in their life together. And this man that she thinks is really nice isn't necessarily as nice as she believed. In fact, she starts realizing he has some pretty high-level sexual fetishes and she doesn't enjoy them. She said he was a sexual sadist. He enjoyed inflicting pain on others through S&M and bondage. As I always say in these videos and in my content, if you like S&M, BDSM, if that's your thing and you have a consenting partner, there is absolutely no harm in it whatsoever. It's when somebody feels that they have to do something when they're pleasing a partner, but they're not enjoying it. You know, that is where power dynamics are really skewed. And when we're talking about a case like this, well, it's not even really S&M in the context of sexual gratification. This is just torture. This is just somebody being an abuser and a violator. It's not really even in the ballpark of things like S&M and bondage. Janice even said that he'd take her into the woods, he'd hang her from her wrists from trees, he liked to whip her, and she put up with it. Even though she despised it, She put her with her husband's predilections until she literally could not stand it anymore. And she said, I can't do this anymore. But even though she asserted that she didn't want that in her world, his cravings remained. And it's at this point he decides that he's going to look elsewhere. And he looks for a victim that he can sexually torture to essentially fulfill his warped desires. Janice told authorities how Colleen had been abducted, how she'd been kept as a sex slave for the past 7 years for that exact purpose. However, she didn't just tell the police that. She said that Colleen was not the only person that he abducted. She said this was not the first woman he'd taken. And she claimed that Hooker was responsible for the kidnap and murder of an 18-year-old woman who disappeared on the 31st of January 1976. That's 16 months before they kidnapped Colleen. Janice said that she had seen the woman's driving license and she knew that her name was Marie Elizabeth Spanhake. It was her photo that Colleen had seen beneath Hooker's bed. It was her presence that Jodie Foster and her daughter would sense in her apartment a quarter of a century later. Marie was better known to her friends and family as Marlies, and she had vanished from Chico, California. She'd just moved to the area. She was with a fiance at the time, 24-year-old John Baruth, and they'd moved there together literally a month earlier. She'd been looking for work. She managed to secure some part-time job working as a model in a camera shop. On one occasion, the couple had gone to a flea market, but as many young people do, they got into an argument and Maria decided to go off in a huff. She decided to walk home by herself. She never arrived home. She was never seen from that day. She just vanished without a trace. John reported her missing 2 days later. That's on the 2nd of February 1976. Every single item of her clothes, all her possessions, they were all still at their apartment. So they knew it wasn't just a case that she decided to leave him. It was a complete mystery. It's strange though, because on several occasions following her disappearance, John would receive strange phone calls, and after silence, the person on the other end of the line would simply hang up. Now, unsurprisingly, John was initially suspected of being behind a disappearance. We all know that if you go missing and if you disappear in strange circumstances, they often look at your nearest and dearest as suspects. But he denied from the get-go that he wasn't involved. I even took and passed a lie detector test, and they had no evidence, literally zero evidence on him. But that meant, on top of that, there was no new leads. They looked in his direction because he seemed like the obvious choice, but it was clear he had nothing to do with it. And then they looked around and there was nothing. She just disappeared into thin air and the case went cold. Now, according to Janice, this is what happened. They had been shopping together in Chico and they spotted Marie. She was walking home. It was around 4 p.m. So they offer her a lift. Just like, to some degree, Colleen's experience, everything initially seemed to be okay. And they'd even arrived at Marie's destination. They stopped to let her out. And this is when it all turns. Because as they let her out, Hooker changes his mind. He grabs her wrist, he drags her back into the car, and then he just continues driving. And then at some point, he forces Marie to put that box that he built onto her head. They get back to their residence, and like Colleen, she's immediately taken to the basement. She's hung from hooks in the rafters. Janice said that she just remained upstairs on the couch in shock. Whilst this is playing out, she can't believe what is happening. Hooker had threatened to slice through Colleen's vocal cords, remember? That's what he said to her when he kidnapped her that first night, when he says to her, if you scream, if you make a noise, I'm going to cut through your vocal cords. I'm going to render you silent forever. According to Janice, that threat was something that he actually carried out on Marie. She was hanging there naked, and he decides that he's going to cut through her vocal cords, but he doesn't do it right. He ultimately goes and gets a towel to stem the bleeding. Apparently, at this point, she's trying to speak to him, but she couldn't speak because of the wound to her throat. So he gets a pencil and paper, and she writes down, and she writes that she would give Hooker anything he wanted, if he'd just let her go. It's not long after she writes this note that Hooker comes upstairs. He's in a panic, and he tells Janice that he has killed her. Allegedly, he'd shot her at least twice in the stomach with a pellet gun. It was to be a form of torture, but then he goes ahead and strangles her to death. Janice then claims that they rolled her body up in a blanket and they carry it to the car. They drive into the mountains and they bury her in a shallow grave along a dirt road. Janice said that they then had burned every single one of her possessions aside from a gold watch, because Hooker had kept that as a trophy and he used it every single day. That was until it was destroyed in an accident at work. It's quite unnerving, isn't it, when you think about how similar Jodie Foster's nightmarish visions were to Marie's alleged torture and murder. Even seeing Janice sat upstairs, probably rocking forward and backward, knowing what was going on beneath. All of this is what Jodie and her daughter had visions of. Now, I will tell you that ultimately authorities were unable to corroborate Janice's allegations, and the search for Marie's remains proved futile. Also, Hooker completely denied the allegations. Accordingly, no charges for her kidnap and murder were brought against Hooker. I have no idea why. Literally no idea why. I appreciate there is no body, but forget the psychic visions, which is spooky beyond belief, but forget all of that. We have a woman who goes missing around the time that she disappeared, the last sightings of her. We have a woman who says that they picked up that particular victim. She's murdered in a way that he could have murdered Colleen and threatens to murder Colleen. Her torture is carried out in exactly the same way. And what benefit is there to Janice to tell this story? She's said that she is going to tell the truth. As per the agreement with the court, she is going to tell them everything. She is telling them everything. And what is frustrating about this is that for the family of this poor girl, for Marie's family, they don't get that closure, but they must, I believe, have connected that that has to have been how Marie died. It has to have been. Now, Hooker is arrested, of course, and charged with the kidnapping, false imprisonment, and of course, multiple sex offences in relation to his captivity and abuse of Colleen. And he pleads, of course, guilty to all the charges because he's bound to rights. He's got his wife saying this is what happened. He's got the victim. All the evidence is there, so it's clear that he's going to make it a plea deal with the state to ensure that he gets a sentence that is maybe lesser for just acknowledging all the charges. Of course, that didn't happen. Never happens. Has it ever happened in one of my cases? No. If it happens, I don't know. Maybe light from the gods will come down and beam on my face. Who knows? But at this point, Classic says not guilty. Not guilty of any of it. Janice, fortunately, as we know, has agreed that she's going to testify against Hooker in return for immunity from prosecution. That meant that at the 1985 trial, both Janice and Colleen gave evidence. Apparently, when Colleen was giving the evidence, she was really flat. She was unemotional, and she just described her 7-year-old deal. She said that she'd been brainwashed, that she feared the company was coming to get her. She also described how she spent the majority of her captivity in a box beneath Hooker's bed. There were various items of evidence that were shown to the jury that included the head box, the photographs of Colleen in bondage, a copy of the slavery contract, the waterbed pedestal, and its concealed box. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what planet is this man on thinking he's going to get not guilty? He's like, obviously it was consensual. I have a slave contract. Like, how can you not see that that's evidence on my side? I literally have a signed slave contract that says I own her soul. Totally normal. Nothing to see here. Innocent. Move on. jury would have been like, I mean, guys, he was going down when I saw the head box. Hadn't even got to the pictures. Forget the slave contract. The head box was enough. In fact, can we bring in a law where he has to wear it for the next, I don't know, lifetime? Just saying. If the cap fits and all that. Or if the box fits in this particular case. Now, Hooker's defense team, of course, they're going to be like, nothing to see here at all. Colleen was not a sex slave. At the end of the day, she was compliant. Okay, he did kidnap her. He's admitted that. He did kidnap her and he did keep her in a box. Just go with me, guys. This is literally the defense. So yeah, we just run through that again. He's like, I'm not guilty. And they're like, oh, he's not really guilty. He's a bit guilty. He's a little bit guilty, but he's also very honest. So he said, I did kidnap her. I did keep her in a box. But that was it. Aside from that, everything else was just gravy between us. She had been completely available to me in the S&M activities. She was a willing participant. You know, I evidence all of the opportunities that she had to escape. She'd never taken them. Look, I took her home to her family. She came back to me. She loved me. She loved my children, who she cared for. We were kind of a bit of a weird nuclear family type thing. Okay, there was a threesome. Okay, she was a sex slave. Okay, I had a contract owning a soul. But at the end of the day, totally normal. She was completely into me. That was the defense. Yeah, I know. I'd have loved to have been the prosecution in this case. Now, in spite of that sterling argument that, yes, he had kidnapped her, yes, he had forced her into a box under a bed for 23 hours a day, aside from that, he was completely innocent. The jury were like, you're not. So he was guilty on all counts except one. And they didn't go easy on him. They were like, how long shall we imprison him for? And then they came out with 104 years. So that's a relatively long sentence. Now, there were changes in the state law, and those changes saw that sentence reduced to 74 years. But we can all agree that the reason that they are comfortable with reducing it to 74 years is that man would never walk the streets again. At least we would hope they wouldn't. Superior Court Judge Clarence B. Knight. Well, he referred to Hooker this way. He said, he was the most dangerous psychopath I have ever encountered. And this might get you a little bit when I tell you that Hooker was initially due to be eligible for parole in 2023. Yeah, it's 2022 now, and initially he's meant to be up for potentially being released under license in 2023. But this is going to blow your mind. It gets brought forward. Yeah. All of you sitting there thinking, and then they decided that he would never be granted parole ever in the universe, and they were going to give him a new parole date of 3078. No, they bring it forward to 2015. This is under California's elderly parole program. Now, this is a good program, by the way. This is a really good program because under this program, prisoners of a certain age who've served a certain length of time in prison are eligible for an earlier elderly parole hearing. And the reason I say that these are good is there are people known as silver lifers, and some of these silver lifers have gone to prison for their entire life for literally being present when a crime occurred. There were certain scenarios tried where, and women in particular have been victims of this, somebody went to a party with another party and that other party shoots somebody. Because they are present with that individual, they are seen as part of the crime. Some of them were given full life terms. They weren't actually the violator of that crime. They weren't actually the perpetrator who is a problem, and they had their whole life wiped, so to speak. So they have started looking at these elderly parole hearings because these individuals who were not a threat anyway have served this incredible amount of time inside, and are they going to be a threat to society? So he comes up on this program. Anyway, unlike those individuals that I've just discussed there who genuinely deserve to be tried and heard in those kind of elderly parole hearings, he gets denied parole. Now, initially, he was told that he would not get the opportunity to apply for it again for another 15 years. So even though he's denied it at this moment in time, he's told, you know what, in 15 years, you'll be able to potentially apply for it again. That would be 2030. But it seems that that is not necessarily how it's going to end for him, because he may instead soon be classified as a sexually violent predator, which means that he'll be committed to a state hospital, which some of you may think, well, he shouldn't go to hospital at the end of the day. He should remain in prison till he is carried out in a box, ironically. But no, he's going to potentially be placed there, so he won't get out at all. And arguably, we would all like for him to be locked up in a place where he's never going to get the freedom to do any of these horrible things again to anybody else. And as far as I'm concerned, this is the absolute right decision. I mean, to some degree, I kind of think being in a cell is where he deserves to live out his days. But okay, if this means that he's never going to get out, then he should certainly be committed to a state hospital, because he's shown no remorse. He's been in prison a hell of a long time, you know? He has had time to adjust his behaviour. He's had time to acknowledge what he did and the depravity of what he did. He's had an opportunity to be restorative in the way that he approaches this and to try to make amends to his victims to some degree, albeit shallow. Apologies may not make a difference in the long term to the way that somebody's life has played out after the attack and violence that they've suffered. But it certainly at least means that the victim can have a level of understanding that their perpetrator recognises what they did was abhorrent and wrong. No, not him. He's never even attempted to understand the reason behind his offending or attempted at any point to reform his behaviour at all. And you know why that is? It's because people like him do not have a conscience. They do not believe what they did was wrong. They see people as objects. So him using people in his warped way, well, it's legitimate in his mind. And add to that the fact that he twisted Colleen's relationship with him. He decided that at some point she became a willing participant in a romance with him. So he buys into that bias, and that's what's allowed him to some degree to not repent. Now, unsurprisingly, when you look at his life, he has carried on regardless in prison, hasn't he? Just got on with his life, never actually acknowledged that he's done anything wrong. And his psychology is such that he can just carry on each and every day being that human being because there is no conscience there. But it's different for Colleen. Colleen went on to have a troubled life. And we understand why. Look, she's had several failed marriages. And if you think about the mindset that she's going to have after being locked in some torturous mindset of being this victim who is constantly at risk, when you meet other people, it's going to serve a purpose to put you in two extremes. Either very rigid boundaries, where if somebody does anything wrong, you're like, I can't be with this person because they're breaching my trust. So that breaks down because there's no collaboration, there's no compromise. Or you get what I call elastic boundaries, which is where you're so unsure of what a good relationship is that when anybody treats you in an acceptable way, you believe that it's going to be better than what you've had before. And bear in mind what she has been through with Hooker. It understandably means that she believes to some degree that being treated in a consensual manner is going to be better than the relationship she had with him. So that might make her vulnerable to, shall we say, less savoury characters in relationships. I'm not saying that that's the case for her exes, by the way. I'm saying it could be one of those extremes. She has also had a child, and that child has gone on to have problems. That child ended up in prison. So there has been some dysfunction in her life, and I think we can all have every sympathy and empathy with Colleen, because what she endured, as I said, it takes a warrior to survive. She ended up joining a Reading Women's Refuge Centre as a volunteer, and that's actually an organisation that helps abused women. So she's trying to give back, and boy, her lived experience is something that can certainly help inform others that they have the potential to survive the most heinous of circumstances, because she did. Janice, well, she's had a really interesting story. So the first thing that she does when she gets out of the marriage is she instantly changes her maiden name back to Lashley. Rightfully so. You don't want any associator with that psychopath, do you? Then in 1998, she actually becomes a social worker. This is in Butte County. So she starts giving back to her community. I mean, that's what social workers do. They're protective in nature. So she kind of goes full circle, doesn't she? and ends up trying to do what is best for people who are in need and who are vulnerable. And I guess that part of that is her making amends. And Colleen and Janice actually ended up living nearby, and Colleen worked as an office manager. But even though they lived in the same proximity and worked in the same proximity, they didn't actually keep in contact. And that doesn't surprise any of us, does it? I mean, why would you want to be reminded of that heinous time in your life? It would just be provocative of so many different emotions and difficult emotions. I understand that they would keep their distance, but they obviously would have moved in similar networks and could have crossed each other in the street. Going back to the very beginning, when I introduced this case, Jodie Foster, the woman who claimed to have seen graphic visions of Marie's abuse and torture, well, she ended up getting consulted on more than one occasion to assist in the search for that poor victim's remains. To date, that case remains unsolved. No trace of her body has ever been discovered. Whether you believe in the paranormal or otherwise, can we all agree it's uncanny, the fact that Jodie moved into an apartment that Marie lived in, started having these visions, that her own 2-year-old daughter started referring to the woman who kissed her on the forehead and using a name that was very similar to Marie's nickname. Can we all agree that that does seem as if potentially there was a connection there? And maybe it is that Marie wanted the legacy of her death to be known, the fact that she was a victim to this heinous predator. I cannot say he absolutely did it, but I don't see why I wouldn't trust Janice. And Marie disappeared, without a doubt, could have ended up in a very similar situation. And the way that he was going to cut Colleen's vocal cords, and Janice said that's actually what happened to Marie, all of these things tie in. And I wonder how Jodie feels knowing that potentially she held the key to the last experiences of Marie before she entered whatever dimension she's in now. Anyway, like I said, quite unnerving when you think about that little girl and her mum moving into the apartment and being so terrorised and terrified about the visions that they were having because they were so torturous and terrifying that they ended up going and moving in with a friend, only to discover that that was the very apartment that Marie had last lived in before she disappeared. Personally, for me, it definitely sent shivers down my spine when I was reading up on the connection between Jodie and Marie. Like I said, for me, it's really sad that her family haven't got the absolute answers, but I hope that what Janice said has brought them some level of understanding about what could have happened to her. If you found this case interesting, give me a comment, give me a like if you've liked it, subscribe if you haven't. Go on, subscribe, it takes a second and you'll get notifications of when I release my content. If you do want to get any merch, then my link is below. I'm wearing one of my tops now. It says a lot about my character. Apart from that, guys, as ever, thank you so much for all your support. I appreciate you massively, and I'll see you next time for more true crime with me, Emma Kenny. Take care.